It's November 2021 and a fleet of Russian T-80 tanks are rolling into Crimea. These tanks will eventually find their way into Ukraine, where they'll be used as part of the concerted ground offensive Russia's been operating for most of the year. But there's something strange about these T-80s. A video of one struggling through the mud in Crimea showed what appeared to be a load of junk wrapped around its turret. Closer inspection revealed that junk to be a makeshift slat roof, looking almost like a garden table, and later pictures on Twitter showed that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. More T-80s rolling into Crimea had them, and even more strangely, every single one seemed to be a makeshift roof rather than following any structured design. This junk wrapped around the T-80 turrets turned out to be cope cages. They were supposed to be Russia's big defense against the anti-tank capabilities that Javelin missile systems brought to Ukraine. But have they worked out the way they were intended, or did cope cages turn out to be a complete waste of time and effort that ultimately proved ineffective while making Russia look ridiculous in the eyes of its enemies? This video aims to find out, and we'll start with the most obvious question. What is a cope cage? Cope cages have several more official-sounding names. Cage armor, slat armor, and bar armor are all terms that give a better idea of what they're supposed to do: protect tanks and other heavy military vehicles against explosive weapons. Specifically, they're supposed to protect against high-explosive anti-tank or heat weapons. These specially shaped charges use the Monroe effect to generate a partial stream of metal that moves at extremely high speeds while maintaining a state of superplasticity, which essentially means the stream won't fracture. In less technical terms, heats can easily punch through solid armor, such as that used for tanks. Interestingly though, the heat acronym doesn't refer to the temperatures the explosives generate, though they'll reach temperatures up to 1,112 degrees Fahrenheit upon impact. That isn't hot enough to melt through the metal used to make tanks, especially given that the explosion itself is over in seconds. Rather, it's the stream the explosives generate that does all of the hard work. Capable of traveling at 25 times the speed of sound, making them hypersonic, the streams can penetrate armor that's between 150% and 200% of their own diameter. Modern variants are sometimes claimed to have penetration capabilities of 700% of their diameter. In short, they're extremely dangerous weapons that can make mincemeat out of a tank's built-in defenses. The key to their success is that they impact their target before exploding, allowing the stream generated to be focused upon the target. That's where cope cages come into play. The idea is that the cages function as a barrier between these heat weapons and a tank's turret, essentially forcing the explosive to detonate upon impact with the cage. The stream ends up being deflected away from the turret, destroying the cage while leaving the rest of the tank relatively unharmed. At least that's the theory, and in some cases, cope cages can prove effective. When designed to scientific specifications, which doesn't seem like the case with the makeshift cages seen on Russian tanks, they're capable of preventing RPGs from detonating on tanks. That's because of their slat pattern. The cages use a grid-like pattern, with the cage itself being positioned so there's a small standoff distance between it and the tank itself. When a projectile strikes the cage, the slats disrupt the shape charge mechanism of the explosive, causing it to lose focus that it needs to penetrate. The cages aren't perfect. Tanks will often suffer superficial damage even with the deflective cages placed on top. But explosives lose much of the penetrative power that makes them so effective at taking out tanks, typically meaning the vehicles can carry on operating, or at the very least the crew inside won't be killed by the explosion. But there are downsides to the cages. For one, even though a cope cage is designed to be lightweight and modular, meaning it can be built up fairly easily on almost any type of tank, it'll still impact the vehicle. A cage adds to the tank's weight, limiting its mobility, and its position over the turret can also hamper visibility. It's also worth pointing out that not any old slat design will work for these cages. Technology.org points out that their effectiveness relies on several factors, including their design, build quality, and how the cage is deployed on a tank or armored vehicle. Get any of these aspects wrong, or even miscalculate by a small degree, and the cage's effectiveness is reduced. Still, the concept is sound. Create a caged suit of armor for tanks that can deflect or at least minimize the explosive impact of weapons designed to take those tanks out. So why is Russia using them? Defense against RPGs is an obvious reason. Ukraine has used these rocket-propelled grenade systems to great effect in its ground war against Russia so far, with cope cages intended to be a counter. It's unknown how many RPGs Ukraine has access to, though. Defense experts report that it's definitely a high number of Polish-made RPG-76 Komars. Videos have surfaced of Ukrainian troops learning how to use these weapons, with that training likely intended to help those troops take out Russian tanks on the ground. But there's another weapon that Russia wants to counter with its cope cages: the Javelin. Developed by Lockheed Martin, the Javelin is technically classed as an anti-tank guided missile. However, it's a perfect example of the heat explosives that Russia wants to counter with the cope cages. The weapon is portable and can be fired from the shoulder, essentially making it equivalent to an RPG in terms of its battlefield usage. However, it's the payload that makes the biggest difference: an 18.5-pound tandem-charged warhead that's capable of punching through around 30 inches of solid metal, perfect for taking out a tank. The warheads have a maximum range of about 1.5 miles and are surprisingly easy to use. Missile Threat says that an operator only has to go through 72 hours of training to become qualified, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a constant stream of Javelin users for as long as it's able to stay stocked up with the weapon. It also fires a missile that is exceptionally difficult for tanks to counter. In its top attack mode, the Javelin missile fires upward, potentially reaching a peak height of 492 feet before striking down directly on top of a tank's roof. That's the most vulnerable part of the tank. The metal is usually thinnest on the roof, which is why Russia's cope cages are placed on top of their tanks. When the missile hits, it does exactly what we described a heat missile to do: creates a penetrative steam of solid materials that breaks through the tank and completely destroys it. The Javelin has proven to be Ukraine's most effective anti-tank weapon, which is why it has so many of them. To date, the United States has provided Ukraine with over 10,000 of these weapon systems, with Lockheed Martin also in the process of nearly doubling its annual production rates from 2,100 in 2023 to 4,000 by 2026. And there are plenty of reports of Ukraine putting it to very good use. In January 2024, Newsweek reported that a Ukrainian paratrooper was able to take out 4 Russian vehicles with just one strike during a battle on the front lines of the Donetsk region. According to Ukraine's 79th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade, that successful strike took the soldiers' personal count of destroyed Russian equipment up to 22, demonstrating just how devastating the Javelin can be when in the hands of a skilled operator. That same soldier is also claimed to have destroyed a trio of Russian tanks alongside 5 of its infantry fighting vehicles in a single attack using the Javelin. Another soldier from the same division is believed to have taken out around 40 Russian vehicles using the Javelin. It's no wonder that Russia wants to find a way to defend its tanks against the Javelin. This weapon isn't your typical RPG. It's packed with so much destructive force that it can cut through the best Russian tanks and armored vehicles like a knife through butter. Solid metal, at least up to 30 inches, can't stop it. And that brings us back to Russia's cope cages and why they're being used on the battlefield. They're supposed to stop the Javelin. The question now is, do they work? In theory, they might. After all, the Javelin is a heat weapon, meaning it's at its most effective as long as the solid-state stream it generates upon impact can be targeted to the surface it needs to penetrate. The idea with cope cages is that they essentially serve as that surface, with the slats helping to deflect the stream away from the tank so it can carry on unscathed. The cage gets destroyed, the Javelin is wasted, and Russia doesn't lose a tank. But is that how it all comes together in practice? The reports of so many tanks being destroyed by Javelins in 2024, well over a year after we first saw Russian cope cages in action, should serve as a clue. It appears all the junk being piled on top of T-80s isn't doing much to stop the Javelin, which leads us to another question. Why? After all, the theory is sound, so what's so wrong about Russia's cope cages that they're incapable of stopping the Javelin? The answer lies in design, both on the Russian end of the spectrum and of the Javelin itself. Russia's cope cages appear to follow no rhyme or reason to their construction. Each that's been seen has been different from the last, meaning they haven't been specially patterned to properly deflect against Javelins. The theory goes out the window when the practical application of the idea is as poor as we've seen on the Russian tanks. And while those makeshift cope cages might still be able to deflect old RPGs that date back to the Soviet era, they're not going to be able to do much against the much more modern and much more powerful Javelin. Then there's the Javelin design itself. It all comes down to the tandem charge nature of a Javelin missile. According to the national news, the Javelin is equipped with a pair of charges. The first, smaller charge is made to specifically blast away any defensive armor that the target might have, with the second charge being much larger and responsible for penetrating the target itself. Typically, the first charge is intended to take out the explosive armor that modern tanks often have on their roofs. But in the context of tanks and cope cages, that would mean a Javelin's first charge would take out the cage, clearing the way for the main charge to penetrate the tank. That appears to be exactly what's happening. Another issue Russia faces is that cope cages are best used to counter anti-tank weapons that have their fuses in the nose. Again, the idea is that the contact with the cage triggers an explosion, with the gap between the cage and the tank helping to mitigate the effects of that explosion. The problem for Russia is that the Javelin doesn't have a fuse in its nose, so a cope cage can't crush the fuse, triggering an early detonation, and it'll instead get ripped to shreds by the Javelin's initial charge. It's also worth pointing out that a Javelin's fuse doesn't work the same way as one in a standard RPG. The Javelin instead has a proximity fuse, one that's capable of detecting the missile's distance from its target. When fired in top attack mode, the Javelin uses that fuse to explode before it would ever make contact with the cope cage. Again, that contributes to the effectiveness of the tandem charge design. The initial explosion takes out the cage before the Javelin's main charge penetrates the tank. So, cope cages seem to be ineffective as a defense against the Javelin or similar next-generation light anti-tank weapons, or NLAWs. And we can see that from Russia's tank loss figures in Ukraine. In February 2024, Reuters reported that Russia is believed to have lost 3,000 tanks during the war, which is a number equivalent to the country's entire pre-war active inventory of tanks. It has plenty in reserve, of course, though many of its other tanks are older and aren't as armored, making them even easier pickings for weapons like the Javelin. Plus, Russia switching to a near full-time war economy means that it's now producing new tanks at a solid rate, allowing it to build replacements. Still, the loss of 3,000 tanks has been a massive dent to its ground assaults, with Russia having to adapt by focusing on aerial assaults, such as its use of glide bombs in Avdiivka. In that context, it's clear that Russia will do anything it can to protect the rest of its tanks. As Alexander Neil, who's a defense analyst based in Singapore, puts it, 3,000 tanks is an astounding figure. Though he points out that some of these 3,000 will have been older tanks, it's likely that Russia has lost much of its advanced tank inventory. And even though it brought between 1,000 and 1,500 tanks into service in 2023, replenishing its stock in the process, the odds are that most of these are older tanks that have been repurposed rather than brand new tanks. So, for as ineffectual as cope cages seem to have been, Russia may still keep using them just on the off chance that they could protect a tank against a Javelin. Russia has also suffered another form of loss from its use of cope cages. It's given Ukraine an easy propaganda victory. Vice reports that Ukraine very quickly sent a message about just how effective its Javelins were about a month after the first evidence of Russia using cope cages on tanks in Crimea emerged. The country posted a training video to its official Facebook page, lasting just 1 minute and 47 seconds. In that video, a Ukrainian soldier briefly discusses the Javelin before showing it being used. The target? A still tank with a cope cage on top. The Javelin obliterated the tank, sending a clear message to Russia that Ukraine had the equipment to render the junk on top of Russia's tanks practically useless. And given that Ukraine has managed to secure a pretty steady supply of Javelins since those early months of the war, Russia likely can't rely on it running out anytime soon. Moscow has also found itself on the wrong side of a meme campaign. Not long after the first images of Russian cope cages emerged, memes soon started cropping up on X to mock them. One image showed Russia's President Vladimir Putin with a cope cage on his head, with later pictures following the same theme. The idea was simple: paint Russia's military staff as small-brained idiots who need cope cages to protect their tiny intellects. Even the Wikipedia page for Russia's T-90 tanks found itself embroiled in a small editing war, with the more charitable term improvised slat armor repeatedly getting changed to cope cage. Now that page includes an entire section dedicated to the phenomena. Ukraine used Russia's tank cages to make Russia itself look stupid, a country using a relic from a bygone era of war to utterly fail in defending itself against Ukraine's more modern weaponry. But how accurate was that depiction really? In other words, despite their ineffectiveness against the Javelin, is there any other reason why Russia would continue to use cope cages? There is, and it's that cope cages are still effective against some of the weapons Ukraine uses to destroy tanks. Take RPGs, for example. Unlike the Javelin and other NLAWs, a standard RPG has no top attack mode. They're not designed to be fired up in the air, with the explosive having any sort of tracking system that could guide it to the top of a target before it fires straight down. Instead, an RPG is fired so that the grenade inside shoots horizontally toward its target. That's where cope cages can be effective. The slat design can crush the fuse in the RPG's nose and deflect the explosion away from the vulnerable tank turret. Even if the rocket is fired at the front, back, or side of a tank, a cope cage can serve the same purpose. There's also an argument that cope cages could at least defend against kamikaze drones deployed by Ukraine. The national news mentions this when it points out that the United States sent Ukraine some Switchblade 600 drones at the beginning of the war, which could theoretically be used to attack Russian tank turrets by being loaded with an explosive and driven into the tank. Alternatively, similar drones could be equipped with explosives that they drop onto the tops of tanks as they fly over. In both cases, a cope cage could prove useful because these types of explosives wouldn't be capable of generating the solid metal stream that the Javelin uses to penetrate a tank's defenses. They're also not carrying tandem charges, meaning a barrier could deflect the attack. There's also evidence that other countries are or have previously used cope cages to great effect. Israel, for instance, is using them in their fight against Hamas. In October 2023, Popular Mechanics published an article showing that Israel had equipped some of its tanks with cope cages, again to provide overhead protection against drones that might drop anti-tank explosives onto them. The move came in the wake of Hamas sharing a video on social media on October 7, 2023 that showed it deploying a $300 quadcopter drone into the field. Fitted with a PG-7V heat round, such as those usually launched from an RPG, the drone was shown flying over an Israeli Merkava tank. The video shows the quadcopter dropping its heat round, which misses the main gun barrel but comes to rest on the armor above the tank's engine compartment. Moments later, fire is shown streaming out of that engine compartment, suggesting the round was successful at crippling the tank. But there are differences between Israel's use of cope cages and Russia's. For one, Israel doesn't have to worry about being attacked with javelins or similar NLAWs. It's fighting insurgents who rely on using RPGs and drones to strike, with the heat weapons it'll face not having the tandem charges seen in the Javelin. So, the cope cage can do its job in this situation by deflecting the explosion away from the tank's body. Videos showing Merkava 4s equipped with cope cages also shows that the armor being used on the Israeli tanks is far more consistent than that seen on Russian tanks. There's clearly a specific design that's being created and followed, meaning Israel's cages are likely built to counter specific weapons. That's a far cry from Russia's cope cages, which all seem to be ramshackle defenses that could have been built using household materials for all anyone knows. In other words, Israel isn't jury-rigging cope cages, it's building them for a specific purpose. Still, this shows that Russia's cope cages could have their uses. RPG and drone attacks are common on the ground in Ukraine, with the cages, if properly designed, being possible defenses against both. The issue is that Ukraine has javelins, and Russia doesn't appear to have invested in actually building suitable cages for its tanks. They're just made out of whatever's available, meaning it's impossible to maintain any sort of consistency. So, with that in mind, why is Russia still using its cope cages? One of the reasons may be that they offer some form of psychological defense for a tank's occupants, even if the cage itself is actually worthless. That's the opinion of Justin Crump, who's the CEO of a risk intelligence firm named Sibylline. Speaking to Business Insider in 2022, he said that cope cages give them psychological protection against weapons, but actually they do very little. That same Business Insider article also shows an old T-55 or T-54 tank with what appears to be a wooden cope cage built on top of it. While the source of that image wasn't confirmed, the tank carried the same Z symbol that many tanks sent into Ukraine carry, suggesting it was actively being used on the front lines. But if a cope cage made using metal would prove useless against a javelin, one made out of wood may as well not even exist. Perhaps there's something to the psychological argument after all. So where does this leave Russia in terms of cope cages? It's clear that the country has decided that the added weight, visibility issues, and potential mobility problems a cope cage created are outweighed by the benefits the cage could provide. And it's true that a cage that's made well enough to deflect an RPG round or an explosive dropped by a drone could save Russian lives and equipment. But the fact is that Russia's cope cages just aren't good enough for either purpose thanks to their ramshackle designs. And when they're faced with a weapon as powerful as the Javelin, as well as any other tandem charge in law, they simply aren't capable of stopping anything. But what do you think? Does Russia deserve all the mockery it's received for its use of cope cages in Ukraine? Or do you think it's a legitimate strategy, albeit one that's been executed poorly, that could save a tank if it faces standard RPG fire or a top-down attack by a drone? Let us know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.